Liam Johnson was a hard-working man who owned a small custom furniture business in the suburbs. His business wasn't huge, but it was steady, and he had built a loyal clientele over the years. Most of his jobs involved large pieces of custom-made furniture, dining tables, wardrobes, and bookshelves that required a heavy-duty truck to deliver. That truck, an old but reliable vehicle with a worn gray exterior, wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was the backbone of Liam's livelihood. Every delivery, every order he completed for his customers relied on that truck being ready to hit the road at a moment's notice. Liam didn't just park it anywhere either. His home, which sat on a spacious lot surrounded by a low wooden fence, had a long private driveway specifically for keeping the truck safe and secure when it wasn't in use. For years, Liam's life had followed a simple, predictable rhythm. He worked long hours in his workshop, met with clients during the day, and spent his evenings unwinding at home, planning the next day's deliveries or designs. His home was his refuge, a place where he didn't have to worry about the outside world or any unnecessary interference. Living in a quiet neighborhood had been one of the key reasons he chose this area. The community seemed peaceful enough, and while there was a neighborhood association in place, Liam had never had any direct dealings with them. He had assumed that since his property was privately owned, with no shared roads or amenities connected to the association's jurisdiction, he wouldn't ever have to get involved in any bureaucratic disputes. That assumption would soon prove to be disastrously wrong. It started like any other day. Liam woke up early, made himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to check his truck before heading to his workshop. But when he opened the door and stepped onto his front porch, something immediately felt wrong. The driveway, which should have been occupied by the familiar sight of his gray truck, was completely empty. At first, Liam blinked in confusion, thinking perhaps he had parked it somewhere else the previous night and simply forgotten. But after a quick scan of the street and yard, it became clear his truck was gone. A wave of panic washed over him. The truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was essential for his work. Without it, he couldn't make deliveries or transport materials, which meant that every day without it would result in canceled orders and lost income. His mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion: the truck had been stolen. Quickly heading back inside, he grabbed his phone and dialed the local police department. After giving them a detailed description of the vehicle and its last known location, Liam was told that an officer would be dispatched to take a formal report. Until then, there wasn't much more they could do. Feeling powerless, Liam paced around his living room, running through every possible scenario in his mind. Who would steal an old delivery truck? It wasn't exactly a luxury car that someone could resell for a lot of money. Maybe it had been towed, but that didn't make sense either. He had parked it on his own private property. And even if there had been some kind of parking violation, wouldn't he have received a warning or a notice beforehand? About an hour later, his phone rang. It was the police officer he had spoken to earlier. The officer's voice was calm but carried a strange undertone. "Mr. Johnson, we've located your vehicle," the officer said. It wasn't stolen. It was towed by the neighborhood association. Liam froze, trying to process what he had just heard. Towed? By the neighborhood association? What are you talking about? It was parked in my driveway. How can they tow a truck from private property? The officer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, explained that they didn't have all the details yet, but it appeared that the association had issued an order to tow the truck, claiming it violated certain community rules. Liam couldn't believe what he was hearing. His truck, parked on his own property, had been towed without any notice, any warning, or any legitimate reason that he could see. Fuming, Liam hung up the phone and immediately headed out to find answers. He didn't care if the neighborhood association was having a meeting, or if he had to wait outside their office for hours. Someone was going to explain to him why they had taken his truck. As he drove toward the small building where the association's office was located, his frustration grew. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an attack on his ability to earn a living. Without that truck, his business was dead in the water. He couldn't afford to sit around and wait for bureaucrats to give him permission to get it back. When he arrived at the association's office, Liam stormed inside and demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. The receptionist, a young woman who looked startled by his sudden entrance, quickly picked up the phone and called someone. Moments later, a tall man in a neatly pressed suit appeared from a side office. He introduced himself as Roy Blackwell, the association's property manager. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you're upset," Blackwell said with a practiced, neutral tone, "but there are rules in place that all residents are expected to follow. Your vehicle was in violation of those rules." Liam could feel his blood pressure rising. "Violation? What violation?" "I parked my truck in my own driveway. That's private property. You have no right to touch my vehicle." Blackwell remained annoyingly calm. The association recently updated its regulations regarding commercial vehicles. Large trucks are not permitted to be parked in visible areas, even on private property, as they detract from the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Notices were sent out to all residents informing them of this change. Liam knew he hadn't received any such notice. "I never got anything," he snapped. "And even if I did, that doesn't give you the right to tow something off my land without a warning." Blackwell shrugged. "We acted within the bounds of our authority. If you'd like your vehicle back, you'll need to pay the towing and storage fees. Until then, it remains impounded." Hearing this, Liam clenched his fists in frustration. He wasn't going to let this go. What the association had done was wrong, illegal, even. He didn't care how long it took or how much of a fight he had to put up. He was getting his truck back, and he was going to make sure they never pulled something like this on him or anyone else again. With that resolve burning in his chest, Liam turned and walked out of the office, already planning his next move. Liam left the office of the neighborhood association feeling angrier than he had in years. He was not the type of person who got involved in disputes or confrontations, but this time it was personal. His truck wasn't just some oversized vehicle to be parked out of sight for aesthetic purposes, it was his livelihood. Every single piece of furniture he handcrafted relied on that truck to be delivered to his customers. Without it, orders would be delayed, contracts would be canceled, and ultimately his entire business could collapse. The association had crossed a line, and Liam wasn't about to back down without a fight. As he drove back home, his mind was racing with thoughts about what to do next. The fees they demanded were outrageous, and the idea of paying them felt like an admission of guilt, something Liam refused to do. He knew deep down that this wasn't about following rules, it was about power. The association had grown more aggressive in recent years, enforcing arbitrary regulations under the guise of community improvement. Liam had heard neighbors grumble about fines for things as trivial as mismatched fence paint or lawn decor that didn't fit their rigid standards, but until now he had managed to stay out of their crosshairs. When he got home, he immediately called his friend Josh, who was an attorney specializing in property law. If anyone could help him figure out a way to challenge the association legally, it was Josh. After explaining the situation, Liam could hear the disbelief in Josh's voice. "Wait, let me get this straight. They towed your truck from your private driveway?" Without giving you any notice beforehand, Liam exhaled sharply. "That's exactly what happened. They're claiming it violated some new rule about commercial vehicles, but I never got any notification about this supposed rule change. And even if they had sent one, they still can't just come onto my property and take my truck without my permission." Josh agreed. "Yeah, something about this sounds off. Associations do have certain rights, but only within the limits of their governing documents. If your driveway is part of your deeded private property and you didn't consent to their actions, they might have acted outside of their legal authority. I'll need to look into this further." Josh promised to review the local property codes and the bylaws of the association to see if there were any loopholes or overreaches in their actions. He also advised Liam to request an official copy of the towing order and any documentation related to the incident, as it would be critical for building a case. Feeling slightly more optimistic after the call, Liam decided to follow Josh's advice immediately. He went online and filled out a formal request for the towing documents through the association's website. However, within minutes of submitting the request, he received an automated response stating that such information could only be obtained by appearing in person at their office during business hours. Annoyed but undeterred, Liam made a note to go back to their office first thing the next morning. That night, as he sat in his living room trying to relax, Liam's mind refused to rest. The whole situation felt surreal. Just 24 hours ago, his life had been running smoothly, his business was stable, his clients were happy, and he had no reason to suspect that something like this could happen. Now, he was faced with mounting frustration, looming expenses, and the very real threat of losing not just his truck, but potentially his reputation with clients if deliveries were delayed too long. Early the next morning, Liam drove back to the association's office, determined to get the answers he needed. When he arrived, the same receptionist from the day before greeted him with a forced smile. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. How can I help you today?" Liam wasted no time. "I'm here to get a copy of the towing order and any related documents. I submitted a request online, but I was told I have to do this in person." The receptionist nodded politely, tapping away at her keyboard before asking him to wait. Minutes passed, and then more minutes, until finally Roy Blackwell, the property manager, emerged from his office. "Mr. Johnson," Blackwell said with a thin smile, "I see you're still upset about yesterday's incident. I assure you we're simply enforcing the rules that have been put in place for the benefit of the entire community." Liam clenched his jaw but forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not here to argue with you about rules, Blackwell. I'm here to request the official documentation regarding the towing of my vehicle. I have the legal right to review it, and I expect you to comply." Blackwell's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course. We have nothing to hide. Please wait here, and I'll have the documents prepared for you." Liam sat down in the waiting area, drumming his fingers on the armrest of the chair as he tried to keep his frustration in check. After what felt like an eternity, Blackwell returned, holding a thin file. He handed it over to Liam without a word, and Liam opened it immediately. Inside was a copy of the towing order, signed by Blackwell himself, along with a brief report stating that the vehicle had been removed due to a violation of the newly implemented regulation regarding the visibility of commercial vehicles. However, what caught Liam's attention was the lack of any prior notice or warning. The report made no mention of any attempt to contact him before the truck was towed, and there was no evidence that he had been informed of the rule change ahead of time. "Is this all?" Liam asked, his tone sharp. Blackwell gave a slight nod. "That's the complete file regarding the incident." Liam stared at him for a moment, then said, "You're aware that towing a vehicle from private property without notice is illegal, right?" "I don't see any documentation here that justifies what you did." Blackwell's expression hardened. "As I said before, Mr. Johnson, we acted within our authority. If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to pursue legal action. Until then, the vehicle remains impounded, and the fees will continue to accumulate until they're paid in full." Without another word, Liam turned on his heel and left the office. He knew he was being baited. Blackwell was trying to provoke him into an emotional reaction, but Liam wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Instead, he drove straight to Josh's office, determined to push forward with legal action. When he arrived, Josh was already waiting for him, having reviewed the association's bylaws overnight. "You were right," Josh said as soon as he walked in. "The association has no jurisdiction over your private driveway. Their actions were completely out of line." Hearing those words gave Liam a brief sense of relief, but he knew the battle was far from over. "They're going to make this as difficult as possible," he said, handing Josh the file he had obtained. Blackwell's already digging in his heels. "They know they messed up, but they're trying to bluff their way through it." Josh nodded. "That's exactly what it looks like. But don't worry, we're not going to let them get away with this. I'm filing an immediate demand for the release of your truck, and if they refuse, we'll take them to court. In the meantime, I'd suggest you keep track of every expense and delay this causes your business. If it comes to a lawsuit, we're going to include damages." Liam felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for his truck anymore, he was fighting to protect his business, his rights, and his livelihood. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a blatant overreach by an association that thought it could get away with anything. But they had underestimated Liam's resolve. He wasn't about to back down. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. Determined to follow through with his fight, Liam left Josh's office feeling slightly more optimistic but still burdened by the weight of the situation. His truck was still impounded, his business was losing money every day it remained out of commission, and the neighborhood association clearly had no intention of admitting any wrongdoing. Even though Josh had assured him that they had a strong case, Liam knew that legal battles were never quick or easy. He needed to find a way to minimize the damage in the short term while preparing for a longer struggle. For now, that meant finding a temporary solution for his business. By the time he got home, Liam had already decided to rent another truck, even if it meant dipping into his savings. He spent the next hour making calls to local rental agencies, eventually finding a vehicle that could serve as a temporary replacement. It wasn't ideal. The rental fees were steep, and the truck wasn't as large or reliable as his own, but it would have to do. He picked up the rental later that afternoon and immediately got back to work, determined to show his clients that he could still deliver, despite the circumstances. Over the next few days, things seemed to settle down, at least on the surface. Liam focused on running his business while Josh handled the legal side of things. Josh had submitted a formal demand for the immediate release of the truck, backed by a detailed letter outlining how the association had violated Liam's property rights. However, as expected, the association's response was less than cooperative. They refused to release the vehicle without full payment of the towing and storage fees, claiming that they were simply enforcing community regulations. Josh, unfazed by their stubbornness, began preparing to escalate the matter legally. He explained to Liam that they would likely need to file a formal lawsuit to force the release of the truck and seek compensation for the damages caused by the illegal towing. "It's going to take time," Josh warned. "They're clearly digging in because they think they can wear you down. But the law is on our side, and once we get this into court, they won't have much ground to stand on." Despite Josh's confidence, Liam couldn't help but feel the growing pressure. Every day the rental truck cost him more money, and although he was managing to keep his business running, the expenses were piling up. Worse, there was a noticeable shift in how some of his neighbors treated him. People he had always exchanged friendly greetings with now seemed more distant, offering only brief nods or avoiding eye contact altogether. It didn't take long for Liam to realize that the association was spreading rumors about him. One morning, as he was loading furniture into the rental truck, his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, approached him hesitantly. She was an elderly woman who had always been kind and chatty, but today she seemed uneasy. "Liam, dear, I just wanted to say, I hope everything works out for you," she said quietly, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "I heard from a couple of folks that the association is saying you were warned multiple times before they towed your truck. I know it's not true, but you know how people talk." Liam clenched his jaw, feeling a fresh wave of frustration. Not only was the association refusing to return his truck, but now they were actively trying to turn the neighborhood against him. "Thanks for letting me know, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate it," he said, forcing a smile. As she walked away, Liam realized that this was likely part of the association's strategy to isolate him, make him seem like the problem, and hopefully pressure him into giving up the fight. But if they thought he was going to back down, they were sorely mistaken. That evening, Liam met with Josh again to discuss the next steps. "They're trying to play the long game," Liam said, recounting what Mrs. Henderson had told him. "They're hoping to make me out to be the bad guy and get everyone in the neighborhood on their side." Josh nodded thoughtfully. "It's a common tactic in cases like this. They want to create enough social pressure that you'll cave before it even reaches court. But if they're resorting to this kind of behavior, it means they know they're on shaky ground legally." Josh's words offered some comfort, but Liam knew that things would likely get worse before they got better. Sure enough, the next day brought another unpleasant surprise. When he checked his mailbox that morning, he found a letter from the association. It wasn't a response to Josh's legal demand, it was a notice of a new fine for violations of community standards. According to the letter, Liam's rental truck was also considered a commercial vehicle and was in violation of the same regulation that had supposedly justified towing his original truck. Liam couldn't believe the audacity of it. They were now fining him for parking the rental truck in his own driveway, even after the fiasco with his original truck. He immediately called Josh, who was equally stunned by the association's blatant harassment. "This is ridiculous," Josh said. "They're clearly just trying to intimidate you, but the fact that they're doubling down like this only strengthens our case. We can add this fine to the list of damages in the lawsuit." Despite Josh's reassurances, Liam felt the stress mounting. It was one thing to deal with the financial burden of renting a truck and fighting a legal battle, but the constant harassment from the association was wearing him down. He began to notice more subtle signs of hostility from certain neighbors. People who used to wave or say hello now ignored him, and he even caught a few of them whispering when they thought he wasn't looking. The association's campaign to turn the neighborhood against him was clearly working, at least with some of the residents. As the days went on, Liam found himself growing more determined. He wasn't just fighting for his truck anymore, he was fighting against a system that thought it could bully him into submission. He knew he couldn't let them win, not just for his own sake, but for anyone else in the neighborhood who might become their next target. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, he received a call from one of his biggest clients. They had a large order ready for delivery, but because of the delays caused by the truck situation, they were considering canceling the contract. Liam pleaded with them to give him a little more time, promising that he could still fulfill the order using the rental truck. After some negotiation, the client agreed to extend the deadline, but the conversation left Liam shaken. If he lost that contract, it would be a significant blow to his business. Feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him, Liam decided to take a small but important step. He installed a security camera on his property, aimed directly at his driveway. If the association tried to pull any more stunts, he would have clear evidence to use in court. He also started documenting every interaction he had with the association, keeping a detailed record of dates, times, and the content of their communications. Meanwhile, Josh continued to push forward with the legal case, filing a formal complaint with the local magistrate and requesting an expedited hearing. He also began reaching out to other residents who had experienced similar issues with the association, hoping to gather additional evidence of a pattern of overreach and harassment. One by one, a few neighbors came forward, sharing stories of fines and violations that seemed arbitrary and unfair. Despite the growing support, Liam knew that the fight was far from over. The association was well-funded and stubborn, and they clearly weren't going to back down easily. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Liam felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and with Josh by his side, he was ready to see it through to the end. Whatever it took, he was going to get his truck back and show the association that they couldn't push him or anyone else around without consequences. Liam's frustration was mounting, but so was his determination. Despite the association's relentless attempts to pressure him into submission, he refused to give in. Every day without his truck meant more financial strain, yet he knew that paying the absurd fines would only embolden them further. Josh was preparing the lawsuit, but Liam realized that winning this case would require more than just legal arguments. It would require exposing the association's questionable behavior and ensuring they couldn't pull the same stunt on someone else in the future. As the days passed, Liam noticed a peculiar pattern. It wasn't just the usual hostility from certain neighbors anymore. There seemed to be specific individuals who watched him more closely than others. One afternoon, while unloading some newly built furniture from the rental truck, he caught sight of a man standing across the street, pretending to inspect his garden while occasionally glancing over in Liam's direction. Liam didn't recognize him, which was odd, given that he'd lived in the neighborhood for years and knew most of the residents by sight. The man didn't appear to be doing anything overtly suspicious, but something about his presence felt off. Brushing it off as paranoia, Liam continued with his work, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Later that evening, Josh called with an update. "I've got some good news," Josh began. "I managed to get in touch with a former member of the association's board. They left the board last year after some internal disagreements, and they're willing to share some information with us, apparently. There's been a lot of tension between certain members of the board about how aggressive they should be with enforcement." Liam's interest peaked. "You think they have something useful for us?" he asked. "Potentially. If we can show that this isn't just about you but part of a broader pattern of misconduct, it could strengthen our case." The following day, Liam met with Josh and the former board member, a middle-aged woman named Diane, who looked relieved to finally be speaking out. "I left the board because I couldn't stand the direction things were heading in," Diane explained. "It used to be about maintaining the neighborhood and keeping things pleasant, but over the past couple of years, It's become more about control. Certain members of the board, especially Roy Blackwell, started pushing for stricter enforcement of every little rule. And they weren't shy about targeting people they didn't like. Liam wasn't surprised to hear Blackwell's name. He had been the face of this entire ordeal from the start. Diane continued, there were always whispers about how some of these fines and enforcement actions were less about community standards and more about power plays. I didn't have hard proof, but I noticed that certain fines seemed to come out of nowhere, and in some cases, people who tried to challenge them would suddenly find themselves dealing with even more violations. She hesitated for a moment before adding, there's something else. I don't know if it's related, but I heard rumors that Blackwell has connections to a local towing company. I can't say for sure, but if that's true, it might explain why they're so quick to tow vehicles without proper cause. This revelation gave Liam a renewed sense of purpose. If they could prove that Blackwell or other members of the association had a financial interest in the towing company, it would be a game changer. Josh agreed, noting that they needed to proceed carefully. If we accuse them of corruption without solid evidence, it could backfire. We'll need to gather more information before we make any formal claims. Over the next few days, Josh focused on tracing the ownership of the towing company, while Liam continued to manage his business with the rental truck. It wasn't easy. Some clients were growing impatient, and the extra costs were eating into his profits, but he refused to let the pressure break him. Meanwhile, the hostility from certain neighbors grew more apparent. One morning, he found a note taped to his front door that read, "Stop causing trouble for the neighborhood." It wasn't signed, but it was clear that someone wanted him to back off. Despite the increasing tension, there were also small signs of support. A few neighbors who had initially distanced themselves from Liam began quietly offering words of encouragement. "We know you're in the right," one of them whispered during a chance encounter at the local store. "They've been out of control for too long. I hope you take them down." These moments gave Liam the strength to keep pushing forward, even as the pressure mounted. A breakthrough came when Josh finally managed to uncover a connection between Blackwell and the towing company. "It's not direct," Josh explained during their next meeting, "but it's enough to raise eyebrows. The towing company is owned by a shell corporation, and guess who's listed as a consultant for that corporation? Roy Blackwell's brother-in-law." Liam felt a surge of vindication. "So they're profiting off these tows," he said. "That explains why they're so quick to tow anything they can. It's a racket." Josh nodded. "This is exactly the kind of thing we needed. I'll include this in our filing and request an injunction to force them to release your truck immediately. If the judge agrees that there's evidence of potential misconduct, they won't be able to keep holding it." The next step was critical. Josh filed the motion, and they waited anxiously for the court's response. In the meantime, Liam decided to take one more precaution. He installed additional security cameras around his property, making sure that every angle was covered. If the association tried anything else, he wanted to have undeniable proof. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week, but before it could take place, something unexpected happened. Late one evening, Liam received a call from an unknown number. Hesitant at first, he answered, and to his surprise, it was Roy Blackwell. "Mr. Johnson," Blackwell began, his tone unusually cordial, "I wanted to reach out personally and see if we could come to some sort of agreement. This whole situation has gotten out of hand, and I think it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve it amicably." Liam was taken aback by the sudden shift in Blackwell's approach. He had been nothing but dismissive and condescending during their previous encounters, so this change in tone was suspicious. "You mean you want me to drop the lawsuit?" Liam said bluntly. Blackwell chuckled nervously. "I'm not saying that. I'm just suggesting that perhaps there's a way to settle this without dragging it through the courts. We could waive the fines, release your truck, and put this whole thing behind us. No one needs to come out of this looking bad." Liam didn't trust Blackwell for a second. It was clear that he was trying to avoid the potential fallout from the lawsuit, especially now that Josh had uncovered the connection to the towing company. "I'll think about it," Liam said, keeping his tone neutral. After hanging up, he immediately called Josh to relay the conversation. Josh agreed that Blackwell was likely feeling the heat and trying to cut his losses before things escalated further. "We could negotiate," Josh said, "but only if they agree to compensate you for your losses and formally admit that they acted improperly." Otherwise, we're better off going to court. Liam didn't want to settle unless it was on his terms. He had come too far and endured too much to let them off the hook without accountability. He told Josh to proceed with the lawsuit, and they began preparing for the upcoming hearing. Despite the stress and uncertainty, Liam felt a renewed sense of confidence. Blackwell's attempt to settle was a clear sign that they were on the defensive, and for the first time since this ordeal began, it felt like the tide was finally turning in his favor. He wasn't just fighting for his truck anymore, he was fighting to expose a system that had tried to exploit him. And with Josh by his side, he knew he had a real chance of winning. The tension in the neighborhood continued to rise as the court date drew closer. Liam could feel the unease every time he stepped outside. Some neighbors avoided eye contact altogether, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of the growing dispute. Others seemed to be watching him closely, as though waiting for him to slip up. It was obvious that the association's board was working behind the scenes, using every tactic they could to undermine Liam's resolve and portray him as the neighborhood troublemaker. Josh had warned Liam that things might escalate as the lawsuit progressed, and sure enough, it didn't take long for the association to make their next move. One morning, as Liam was preparing to load some furniture into the rental truck, he noticed something unusual at the edge of his driveway. A freshly installed sign had appeared overnight, placed just outside his property line. It read "Community Parking Restrictions Enforced. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense." Liam stared at the sign in disbelief. This was clearly aimed at him. The association was trying to create the illusion that they had jurisdiction over his driveway, even though it was private property. Frustrated but determined not to give them the reaction they were hoping for, Liam took a photo of the sign and sent it to Josh. Minutes later, his phone rang. "They're getting desperate," Josh said. "They're trying to establish some kind of implied authority by putting up that sign. Don't touch it yet, I'll file a complaint and request an inspection. If they're placing signs on your property or in a way that misleads others about your rights, it'll work in our favor." Liam nodded, though the irritation gnawed at him. He hated being put in this position, where every step forward felt like a new trap was being laid in his path. Despite the pressure, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about the truck anymore, it was about standing up to a system that thought it could steamroll over anyone who didn't comply with their arbitrary rules. Later that day, Josh called with another update. He had managed to secure a meeting with the local council to discuss the association's overreach. While the council didn't have direct authority over the neighborhood's internal rules, they did oversee zoning and property boundaries, which meant they could intervene if the association was acting outside its designated area. This might not lead to an immediate resolution, Josh cautioned, but if we can get the council to acknowledge that they've overstepped, it'll add more weight to our case in court. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, but in the meantime, the association wasn't letting up. A few days later, Liam received another letter in the mail, this time claiming that his property had been flagged for landscaping violations. According to the letter, his front yard was inconsistent with community standards due to some overgrown shrubs along the edge of his fence. Liam could only shake his head in disbelief. The shrubs in question had been there for years without issue, and now suddenly they were a problem. He knew this was yet another attempt to intimidate him and drain his time and energy. Instead of responding directly, Liam forwarded the letter to Josh, who added it to the growing list of evidence showing the association's pattern of harassment. "They're trying to throw everything at you, hoping something will stick," Josh said. "But every petty complaint they file only strengthens our argument that they're acting in bad faith." Despite Josh's reassurances, the constant stream of threats and fines was beginning to wear Liam down. It wasn't just the financial burden, it was the mental toll of being under constant scrutiny and pressure. He found himself double-checking everything he did, from where he parked the rental truck to how often he trimmed the lawn, knowing that the association was looking for any excuse to come after him. It was exhausting. The final straw came when Liam returned home one evening to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. In bold letters, it read, "Final warning, compliance required immediately." Beneath the heading was a list of supposed violations, including the parked rental truck, the landscaping issue, and even a complaint about the visual clutter caused by tools left outside his workshop. The notice threatened further fines and potential legal action if he didn't address the issues immediately. Liam took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. He wasn't going to let them break him. Instead of reacting impulsively, he called Josh and relayed the latest development. "This is it," Josh said firmly. "They've crossed the line. I'm filing an emergency motion for an injunction. If the judge grants it, they won't be able to impose any more fines or take further action against you until the case is resolved." The next morning, Josh submitted the motion, along with a detailed report outlining the association's repeated attempts to harass and intimidate Liam. They included copies of every letter, fine, and complaint he had received, as well as photos of the unauthorized sign and the orange notice. Within 2 days, they received a response from the court. An emergency hearing had been scheduled for the end of the week. The news gave Liam a sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the association wasn't likely to back down without a fight. True to form, they continued their pressure campaign, sending yet another letter accusing Liam of hostile behavior toward board members. The letter claimed that his refusal to comply with their rules was causing unnecessary tension in the neighborhood and demanded that he attend a mediation session to resolve the conflict. Liam saw the letter for what it was, a ploy to paint him as unreasonable and create a record of supposed attempts to settle the matter outside of court. He showed it to Josh, who advised him not to respond. "They're trying to bait you," Josh said. "If you engage with them directly, they'll use it against you. Just focus on the hearing. That's where we'll set the record straight." As the hearing approached, Liam couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and anticipation. This was his chance to finally push back against the association's bullying tactics and reclaim some sense of control over his life. Josh had prepared thoroughly, compiling all the evidence they had gathered and outlining a clear argument for why the court should grant the injunction. When the day of the hearing arrived, Liam dressed in his best suit and met Josh at the courthouse. As they entered the courtroom, he noticed Roy Blackwell sitting at the front with the association's attorney. Blackwell gave him a smug glance, as if confident that things would go his way. But Liam didn't let it rattle him. He trusted Josh, and he knew they had the truth on their side. The hearing began with Josh presenting their case, methodically laying out the timeline of events and highlighting the association's pattern of harassment. He emphasized how they had repeatedly acted outside their authority, imposed baseless fines, and attempted to interfere with Liam's ability to conduct his business. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking questions to clarify specific points. When it was the association's turn to respond, their attorney tried to argue that they were simply enforcing community standards and acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. But it quickly became clear that their claims were weak. They had no solid evidence to support their accusations, and when questioned about the unauthorized sign and the towing incident, their answers were evasive. After several hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge announced his decision. He granted the injunction, effectively barring the association from imposing any further fines or taking additional action against Liam until the case was fully resolved. It was a significant victory, one that gave Liam the breathing room he desperately needed. As they left the courthouse, Josh turned to Liam with a satisfied smile. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But today we took a big step forward. They know we're serious now, and they're on the defensive." For the first time in weeks, Liam felt a weight lift off his shoulders. There was still a long road ahead, but he finally had the upper hand, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw this fight through to the end. The hearing had been a major victory, but Liam knew it wasn't over yet. The injunction meant the association could no longer impose fines or harass him with bogus violations, but his truck was still impounded, and the lawsuit was far from resolved. He was tired, exhausted, really, but the thought of backing down after coming this far didn't even cross his mind. He had already invested too much time, energy, and money into this fight, and at this point it wasn't just about his truck. It was about making sure the association and people like Roy Blackwell couldn't bully anyone else the way they had tried to bully him. Josh was equally determined. Over the next few days, he ramped up their legal offensive, filing a motion to compel the immediate release of Liam's truck without payment of any fines or fees. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Josh said during one of their meetings. "They've been playing dirty this whole time, but now we have the upper hand. They'll either have to release the truck or explain to a judge why they're refusing, and given the evidence we've gathered, I doubt they want that level of scrutiny." Liam appreciated Josh's confidence, but he remained wary. He knew Blackwell wasn't the type to give up easily, and if there was one thing Liam had learned throughout this ordeal, it was that the association would do whatever it took to protect their image and authority. Still, for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally in control of the situation. The court date for the next hearing was set, and all they had to do was hold steady. But Blackwell had one last move up his sleeve. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Liam received a formal letter from the association's attorney. It was carefully worded, polite on the surface, but unmistakably threatening in tone. The letter offered to release the truck and drop all outstanding fines in exchange for Liam withdrawing his lawsuit and signing a non-disclosure agreement. If he refused, they warned, they would pursue him for additional legal costs, claiming that his actions had caused unnecessary disruptions to the community. Liam knew exactly what they were trying to do. This was a last-ditch effort to avoid public embarrassment. If the lawsuit went to court and Josh presented the evidence they had gathered, it would not only expose the association's questionable practices, but also potentially open the door for other residents to challenge past fines and penalties. The association was scared, and they wanted to bury the problem quietly before it could escalate any further. He immediately forwarded the letter to Josh, who responded with a curt laugh. "They're panicking," Josh said. "This is exactly what we wanted. They know they're going to lose, and now they're trying to cut their losses. But we're not going to let them off the hook that easily." Josh drafted a response rejecting the offer and reiterating their demand for the immediate release of the truck, along with compensation for Liam's losses. He made it clear that they had no intention of withdrawing the lawsuit unless the association admitted wrongdoing and paid for the damage they had caused. The next day, Liam woke up to find a tow truck parked across the street from his house. For a brief moment, panic set in had the association somehow found a way to bypass the injunction and come after the rental truck. But as he stepped outside, he noticed that the driver wasn't approaching his property. Instead, the tow truck remained idling on the street, as if waiting for something. It wasn't until later that afternoon, after Josh had spoken with the towing company, that Liam learned the truth. The association had been quietly moving impounded vehicles to avoid scrutiny, likely in anticipation of the upcoming hearing. "They're scrambling," Josh said. "They're trying to cover their tracks, but it's too late. We already have everything we need." When the day of the hearing arrived, Liam felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He had dressed in his best suit, the same one he had worn to the previous hearing, and met Josh outside the courthouse. "This is it," Josh said as they walked inside. "Stay calm, stick to the facts, and trust me to handle the rest." The courtroom was smaller than Liam had expected, but it was packed with people, other residents, local reporters who had caught wind of the case, and of course members of the association's board, including Blackwell. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge entered and called the session to order. Josh wasted no time laying out their case. He presented a detailed timeline of events, starting with the unauthorized towing of Liam's truck and ending with the continued harassment he had faced in the weeks that followed. He provided copies of the letters and fines Liam had received, photographs of the unauthorized sign, and documentation linking Blackwell's brother-in-law to the towing company. "This isn't about community standards," Josh argued. "This is about a group of individuals abusing their authority to target a resident and profit from it. They towed Mr. Johnson's truck without cause, imposed fines they had no right to impose, and when he refused to comply, they attempted to intimidate him into silence." The association's attorney tried to argue that they had acted in accordance with their bylaws, but it quickly became clear that their defense was weak. They couldn't produce any evidence that Liam had been properly notified of the rule change, and when pressed by the judge, they struggled to justify the excessive fines and threats they had issued. Blackwell, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke up, insisting that the association had only been trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. But his words rang hollow, and the judge didn't seem convinced. After several hours of testimony and cross-examination, the judge called a brief recess. Liam sat with Josh, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. "I think we've got them," Josh said quietly. "They're scrambling, and the judge can see right through it." When the judge returned, he didn't waste any time delivering his verdict. He ruled in Liam's favor, ordering the immediate release of his truck and prohibiting the association from imposing any further fines or penalties related to the incident. Additionally, the judge found that the association had acted in bad faith and ordered them to pay compensation for Liam's losses, including the cost of the rental truck and legal fees. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the judge finished speaking, and Liam felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. As they left the courthouse, Josh turned to Liam with a grin. "You did it. They tried everything they could to break you, but you held your ground. They won't be pulling this kind of stunt again anytime soon." Liam smiled, feeling a sense of vindication he hadn't experienced before. The fight had been long and difficult, but in the end, he had stood up for himself and won. And while the association might have been defeated this time, he knew that if they ever tried to cross the line again, he would be ready. With the judge's decision behind him, Liam finally felt like he could breathe again. The fight had been long, exhausting, and filled with moments of doubt, but he had stood his ground and emerged victorious. The next day, the towing company returned his truck without further argument, and for the first time in weeks, he was able to park it in his driveway, right where it belonged. Seeing it back in its rightful place brought a wave of satisfaction that words couldn't fully capture. He had fought not just for his truck, but for his rights as a homeowner, and that victory meant more than any amount of money. Still, there were loose ends to tie up. Although the court had ruled in his favor, the damage caused by the association's harassment wasn't something that could be undone overnight. His reputation in the neighborhood had been dragged through the mud, and while a few neighbors had offered their quiet support, others remained distant, wary of getting on the association's bad side. Liam didn't blame them. He knew firsthand how relentless the board could be when they wanted something, but he also knew that his victory had set a precedent. If the association tried to overstep its bounds again, the residents would know they had the right to push back. In the days that followed, Liam took steps to rebuild his business. The compensation awarded by the court covered most of his losses, including the rental truck fees and a portion of the canceled orders. He reached out to clients who had been affected by the delays, offering discounts and expedited service to make up for the inconvenience. To his relief, many of them were understanding, and several even praised him for standing up to what they called typical neighborhood power plays. Slowly but surely, things began to return to normal. Meanwhile, Josh continued to work on ensuring that the association couldn't pull the same stunt on anyone else. Using the evidence they had gathered during the case, he filed a formal complaint with the local council, requesting a review of the association's practices. The council agreed to investigate, and word soon spread that new oversight measures were being put in place to prevent further abuse of power by the board. Liam didn't expect the changes to happen overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, as he was working in his garage, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had quietly supported him throughout the ordeal, stopped by with a plate of homemade cookies. "I'm glad you didn't give up, Liam," she said with a warm smile. "You showed them that they can't just push people around." Liam chuckled and accepted the plate gratefully. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. Honestly, I didn't think it would get this far, but once they took my truck, I couldn't just let it go." She nodded knowingly. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about what's right, it's about showing others that they can do the same. Her words stuck with him. The fight hadn't just been about getting his truck back, it had been about drawing a line in the sand, about making it clear that no one had the right to trample over someone else's property and livelihood without consequences. Liam hadn't set out to become a symbol of resistance, but in the eyes of many of his neighbors, that's exactly what he had become. In the following weeks, more neighbors began reaching out to Liam, offering apologies for keeping their distance during the conflict. Some admitted they had been afraid of retaliation from the association, while others simply hadn't known the full story. Liam didn't hold grudges. He knew how intimidating the board could be, but it felt good to see the tide starting to turn. People were no longer as afraid to speak up, and the board's grip on the neighborhood seemed to be loosening. As things settled down, Liam found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He had never wanted a fight, but when it came to protecting what was his, he realized that sometimes you had no choice but to stand your ground. The experience had tested his patience, his resolve, and his ability to endure pressure, but in the end, it had made him stronger. He had proven to himself and to the neighborhood that he wasn't someone who could be pushed around. One evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sunset with a cup of coffee in hand, Liam allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight was over, his truck was back, and his business was recovering. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while he felt ready to face them head-on. The association had tried to break him, but instead, they had only strengthened his resolve. As he took another sip of coffee, Liam noticed a few kids riding their bikes down the street, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhood. It was a simple, everyday scene, but it reminded him why he had fought so hard. This was his home, a place where he deserved to feel safe, respected, and free from unnecessary interference. And now, thanks to his efforts, it truly felt like home again. For Liam, the ordeal had come to an end, but for the neighborhood, it marked a new beginning. The association had been shown that their power wasn't absolute, and the residents had learned that they had the right to stand up for themselves. It wouldn't solve every problem overnight, but it was a start. And as far as Liam was concerned, that was more than enough.